Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Doherty Institute and to this Convergence Science Network event. My name is Luan Esmahill. I'm the network's Executive Director and Convener, and on behalf of the partners, a very warm welcome to you. We've invited someone this evening who has had extensive experience in creating businesses from technology embedded within universities, and Chris Behrenbruch is going to share with us some of his ideas and thoughts about how this issue might be addressed. Please welcome Chris Behrenbruch.
Thank you, Luan, and thank you for the generous introduction. You may be fooled into thinking that I've postulated a question and then answered it on the first slide, that you're not going to kind of have death by PowerPoint for the next 45 minutes. And if that's your assumption, you're sort of going to be a bit disappointed with me. I'm gonna try to keep this as interesting as possible, but I have a few themes that I'd like to touch on that I think are of real importance to the innovation discussion. So I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, their elders past and present, and pay my respects. So when I talk about entrepreneurship, and Monash University and RMIT and a few other universities let me loose on their graduate students a few times a year, I always put forward 3 rules of entrepreneurship at the beginning. So the first one is, you might be an entrepreneur and you might have a crazy idea that everyone thinks is stupid, but at some point you just have to do it anyway. So we should all embrace that philosophy. And your viewpoint might change over time. So 5 years ago, I thought that the toddler mop was a stupid idea. Now I have a 1- and a 4-year-old. I think the toddler mop is an outstanding idea, and I would probably write a check. To be quite honest with you. The second thing is that hindsight is always 20/20. So tonight I'm going to talk about a lot of things from the perspective of battle scars. And I think it's really important when we have a debate about innovation that we have a debate that has both a prospective, unbiased, untainted viewpoint that's theoretical and altruistic. But I think sometimes we also have to have a conversation against the backdrop of reality. And I beg of you tonight not to hear my North American accent and think that I'm going to give you an obnoxious lecture about sort of a cultural context of innovation. I'm not. I grew up in Melbourne and I went away for about 20 years. And I came back because I was excited about what was going on here and I could see the potential for it. So the context of this presentation tonight is actually optimism, not negativity. What I'd like to do is suggest some ways that we can go from good to great. The third thing, and it's a testament to all of you that have come out tonight to hear me talk for your sins, and that is sometimes when I'm dealing with entrepreneurs or someone that's got a new startup, a new idea, they get to a point of impasse. They're sitting at their desk. They're so focused on trying to achieve their next milestone that they get locked down. And sometimes it's really important just to get out of your office and talk to other people. And I think communication and discussion is a very big part of being an entrepreneur. And so it's good that you're here today to have this dialogue. So a bit about me. If you put my surname into a Google search engine, you will find my cousin, who is a German Olympic decathlete. He inherited the good athletic genetics. I did not. I stepped onto a university campus in 1992 and basically never left. And I'm convinced that being a nerd and drinking beer is counterproductive to that objective in life. I wasn't really a very good academic. My PhD supervisor told me that I should not go into academia because I would quote unquote suck at it. And so I've been a confused individual. I've had 1 foot in industry and 1 foot in academia all my life, and that's actually what all my adult life, obviously. That's what I find interesting. In the course of that, I guess I've been involved in starting or financing more than 20 startup companies, mostly in the healthcare space. But I've also periodically ended up inside big companies, and whether through an acquisition or a strategic collaboration or something like that. So a range of experience. My current favorite pastime is harassing ASX-listed bioscience companies. We have a very vibrant bioscience sector, but not all of it is high quality. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today and what it means. So the first thing that I want to talk about this evening is the Valley of Death. And I don't like the Valley of Death. I'm actually really bored of the discussion of the Valley of Death. Every time I sit down in a room full of people discussing innovation policy, the first topic of conversation is the Valley of Death. And I have formed my own theory about the Valley of Death in the Australian context. And if we look at this concept of commitment, innovation, and sustainability, I think that our biggest risk for the Valley of Death is pontificating at the abyss. I think that our biggest problem is that we are not fully committed to this process. Okay? And so what I'd like to do is, as a subtext to this evening, I'd like to propose to you an alternative way of crossing the Valley of Death. If I were to go out and interview and canvass all of you in this room and ask you, what do you think are the ways to traverse the Valley of Death? You would say, well, it would be funding. It would be, effective government policy, stable government policy. It would be multinational engagement. It would be a non-dysfunctional venture capital industry. You'd give me all of these answers. But I think that the correct answer in the Australian context is called the trestle bridge of dead bodies. Okay? I think that the number one missing aspect that has the potential to kickstart a great innovation ecosystem in Australia is this lack of experience with failure. Not a risk aversion. I want to talk about risk this evening, and I want to talk about some of the cultural aspects, but I don't feel that we have a risk-averse culture. I just think we haven't taken the first step of allowing that in order for us to get experience and develop skills and have human capital that's capable of translation of innovation, we need to have that trestle bridge of dead bodies. It's a bit squishy, it's a bit smelly, but it is a way to cross the Valley of Death. And for every innovation hotspot in the world that has this veneer of greatness and success, I promise you there is a catacomb of dead bodies underneath that, all right? And we need to establish that domestically as well. So this is very important to my journey. So these are a smattering of the companies that I've been involved in starting, and I have a lot of dead bodies in my closet, right? I'm not proud of all of them. Some of them were very painful. Some of them cost me a lot of money. But I do have them. And what it means now is that when I look at an opportunity or I'm presented with something to consider, either as an investor or as an advisor, I have the ability to draw upon the things that went wrong for me in the past. And it affords me a position of great strength. And I think that's something that we need to develop more as an ecosystem. I'm also a bit offended about the concept of taking risk. Now I look in the room and I see a huge diversity of people. When I was looking at the attendance list, there are industry people, there are academics, there are government people. You come from a very wide range of backgrounds. And therefore to make this sweeping assertion that risk is somehow a homogeneous thing is a bit false. Right? So I hear it all the time. I attend workshops where we hear, in Australia we have this very risk-averse culture. And I just don't feel that that's the case. So let me illustrate that in a few ways. Now, if I look at myself 10 years ago, and I thought, what would be the greatest risk that could enter my life, it would be that. Okay? But I'm bound to say that most of you find that a palatable risk. Even those of you that have two families in different cities. Just joking, Simon. So it's an acceptable risk, right? Is anyone a sashimi aficionado in the room? Does anyone know what this is? Call it out. Fugu, right, yes. So about 3 weeks before my first child was born, I was in Japan on a business trip, and I went out with some colleagues to celebrate my pending fatherhood, and they served me up this tasty dish of sashimi, and I wolfed half of it down, and then I asked what it was. And they said, it's fugu. I thought a plate of neurotoxin was a strange way of celebrating pending fatherhood. Right? Perfectly acceptable risk for other than the 650 Japanese a year that die from poorly prepared fugu fish. Before I became a responsible adult, I enjoyed adrenaline sports. Now, I'm not allowed to do adrenaline sports anymore, but I think some of you in the room would feel that jumping out of a perfectly good airplane was a stupid idea, right? But some of you might, fancy the idea. And then I think last of all, there's the cultural context. So for me, if it doesn't have, side impact protection and at least 11 airbags, it's probably not an acceptable family vehicle, right? But for some people, and even some people in this room, that might be a perfectly acceptable family car or family vehicle, all right? So risk is a deeply personal thing. It's also a variable. It's not a constant, right? So it changes as a function of time, right? So when we make the statement that we're a risk-averse society, what are we doing? Are we time-stamping that statement? It changes as a function of our financial capacity. It changes as a function of our success, of how we feel about our life. It changes as a function of our health. One of the best entrepreneurs that I ever worked with was the least entrepreneurial person you've ever met in your entire life, right? But she was a breast cancer survivor, and she had survivor's guilt. And she had some technology that she thought would make a difference, and she decided that she would commercialize that technology, build a wildly successful company, have the financial capacity to build a foundation to conduct the research that she thought was necessary to advance the field. Not interested in making money, not interested in buying a better car, just wanted to achieve a certain outcome, right? And that was motivated by something that she felt about her change in life status. And then, of course, the world is not static as well. So I reject this concept of risk altogether. And so let me put this to you in perspective in an innovation context. So I do a bit of work with the World Economic Forum, and a few years ago we had a sort of a healthcare think tank around technology in emerging markets. And we put together a bunch of case studies to try and understand, like, what would be the impact of advanced technology, advanced manufacturing technology on healthcare in emerging economies. So this was one of the case studies that we put together. So you have someone in rural China, has a family member that gets cancer, goes online, finds out that there's a biotech company in South San Francisco that has, or Parkville, that has a cure for that cancer, but it costs $100,000. So what are you going to do? So we threw this out to a room full of really smart people, and we got a bunch of interesting answers. What we in particular want to know is how far would you go to get it, right? So we had people, they would crowdsource, and they would lobby their governments, and they would sell everything, and they would rob a bank, right? There's quite a few politicians in the room. One Chinese politician said that his sister was quite handsome, and that he could imagine a compelling revenue stream associated with that. It's good to know that politicians are sort of the same the world over. But anyway, so there were lots of answers that came out, but the most interesting answer was, why not make it, right? So if you think about it, that's not a ridiculous concept. You know, we're in the era of 3D printing. You can go online and you can find an instruction manual to make a pipe bomb or a handgun or an internet streaming video server. So why not a drug? So it turns out that that's a perfectly viable thing to do. You can go online. So in this case, go to Swissprot or some online database, download the sequence for Herceptin, which is an antibody drug that's in wide use. You can have that turned into a gene construct that you can then send to hundreds of potential manufacturing facilities around the world that will crank out some protein that's expressed by that gene, of varying quality, of course. And then you go to your local 7-Eleven and you take some saline, some contact lens solution, mix it up and inject it into your mom, right? How much more straightforward could it be? So is it advised? No. I mean, there's all kinds of garbage and contaminants and viruses. But you know, it might be on the risk balance equation, it might be a perfectly viable thing to do. Weird mouse virus or breast cancer, right? But it's absolutely a reality. And so, you know, technology democratizes anything that has a socioeconomic delineation. And clearly healthcare segments by purchasing power. And so clearly this is going to happen, right? So that's an example of where need, you know, drives innovation. Okay, so what about Australia? So we're here assembled in the lecture theatre of a terrific Australian university, a terrific global university. So what about the Australian context? Well, I think academics are inherently entrepreneurial. I've chosen an example. This is a Stentrode that's gotten a lot of press, a lot of PR lately because Obama held it up as an example of why aren't Americans doing stuff this good, which I thought was terrific. You can't beat publicity like that. Well, what I've done is I've chosen a definition of entrepreneurship that I particularly like. It's by an academic from a small Boston community college. And it's a nice definition of entrepreneurship, which I'll read Entrepreneurship is a recognition and pursuit of opportunity without regard to the resources you currently control, with confidence that you can succeed, with the flexibility to change course as necessary, and with the will to rebound from setbacks. Now, I know that there's a fair proportion of you in the room that are academics. And I bet you that this definition resonates with you, right? You don't control any resources. You beg, borrow, and steal every single day. Your grants are constantly getting rejected, at least 90% of the time, all right? You have unlimited confidence that you're smarter than anybody else on the planet and can't understand why your grants are getting rejected all the time. And you're flexible because, you know what? The next idea that comes along will be your greatest idea, right? So I think academics are naturally entrepreneurs. And in fact, I will say that some of the most entrepreneurial people I've ever met are academics. And I think that applies in universities. So therefore, that inherently supports the thesis that universities can be a great place for innovation. Okay, so now let's ask the question, well, how can they be, supercharged? So on the first, cut of everything, our universities are decent, and that's important. So this is a map of the top 800 universities in the world. Australia has a good smattering. We have a bunch of universities that are in the top 100. We even have some faculties and departments that are in the top handful, including in this university and my alma mater, Monash. So that's great. That's a very compelling starting point. The problem is that our universities don't interface well. So this is a network map that myself and a few colleagues put together a few years ago while I was doing some work with the Grattan Institute. And we interviewed 100 CEOs of Australian technology-led companies, and we asked them where they felt the matches and mismatches were in this innovation network. And the striking and consistent answer was that the worst interface point was between universities and small to medium-sized enterprise, by far the worst point of interface. And the general feedback we got is it's difficult to work with universities, it's bureaucratic, it's slow, it doesn't meet our timelines, they don't speak our language. It was very consistent. By the way, as somebody that's heavily involved in university tech transfer at a number of good universities, I would say that there's some merit to that viewpoint. So the question is, how can we unstick that and get that engine moving a bit more? To be honest with you, I don't think it's about intellectual property. So this graph gets shown a lot, our international trademarks against international patent prosecution. And Australia comes up a little bit average looking. And if you actually go on to the World Patent Organization, Intellectual Property Organization website, and you have a look at what organizations in Australia capture a lot of IP, it's really a handful. There's like 20 institutions that capture more than 4 or 5 patents. It would be a couple of universities, it would be Rio Tinto, it would be Cochlear, right? It's really not that many organizations that are aggressive. And I think relative to the size of our country, that's okay. And the main reason is, and I know that there are economists in the room, and I know that I've had drunken debates with you about this in the past, so please don't hold it against me. But the reality of it is that we buy our innovation, we don't create it. We're, as a country, as an economy, we are extremely good at purchasing innovation. Now, for our university sector, that's actually good. There's no less of a need for skilled labor, highly skilled people to import and implement innovation. We still need the best people. So our universities are not going to be out of a job because we import our innovation. And so, but what it does do is it raises some questions about whether the conventional metrics that we use for success and the conventional tools that we might use to understand how to get that ecosystem moving a little better, whether or not they're applicable. And I think that this viewpoint, this lens is not the most important one. And if you compare, and Luan said it very nicely in the beginning, if you look at this on an OECD basis, there are clear skill set, there are clear gaps. Intellectual property is one. Personally, I don't think it's the biggest one. Global integration. Personally, I think global integration is not an issue for our universities. Our universities are highly interconnected. Education is a major export strength for Australia. So in that segment, I don't think the universities have a problem. I think the problem is in business innovation activity, knowledge exchange, and skill base. I think those are the 3 areas that contribute most to perhaps the lack of efficacy in our university environment being innovative and entrepreneurial. So let's start with skill base. So I was involved in doing a survey of a peer group of universities, about 25 universities that we selected that we believe are actual and aspirational peers to Australia's Group of 8. And they're universities in the US, Canada, UK, and in Europe. And what we found is that globally, in that peer segment of universities, that PhD and postdoctoral students were the most productive, at the highest innovation output of any part of the university innovation environment, followed very closely by early career researchers. Unfortunately, and I'm sure it's not entirely counterintuitive, but established, tenured academics are not the great innovators. They don't have the great ideas, and they're not usually the most collaborative. Now in Australia, my experience in working with hundreds of HDR students, hundreds of PhD students, is that they basically don't feel like they're part of an innovation environment. I believe that the vast majority of PhD students in science, in STEM and in medicine feel that they're essentially contract labor for their supervisors. Now that's not perhaps a unique sentiment for Australia. I think most PhD students around the world feel like they're contract labor for their supervisors. But in Australia, I think they make little, if any, contribution to knowledge capture. And I don't feel that they own the concept of innovation. And there's some data that I have that supports that thesis. And so there's a little Chinese proverb that says, little snowflakes make big rivers. I guess that's in reference to the Yangtze. And I feel that in the case of our PhD postdoctoral segment, that's a very relevant analogy, because internationally, in that peer group of universities, we see one invention disclosure, not a PCT, not a granted patent, but one invention disclosure for every 8 PhD students in STEM with 2 M's. In Australia, it's more like 1 in 30. Okay, so our postgraduate and early career researchers are not really engaged in this process of innovation capture for whatever reason. They're not. So for whatever reason it is, I think there's some easy fixes to that. First of all, I think we need to invest more in doctoral training. I have relationships with most of the Australian Group of 8 universities, and I see a real unmet need for this. I think we need to produce graduates that have more industry readiness. 70% of our PhD students will end up in industry anyway, so we should prepare them for that. We should give them the skills of teamwork and communication. We should help them to understand what's involved in IP capture and managing intellectual property. I believe personally that we need more independent scholarships for PhD funding, that we should build a system where students select faculty on the basis of their supervisory and innovation propensity, not necessarily faculty selecting students to pad out their bench or their research program. And I think we need more industry-based doctoral training opportunities. I think some of the best research that I've ever seen in my career came out of actually placing researchers into industry and giving them access to everything that industry has. I can't frankly think of a better way of improving the interface between university and industry than funding that. That's a great place for the government to spend money. And I'll tell you, employers and even SMEs, I've been there myself 5 or 6 times as a CEO of small companies, perfectly willing to write a check to match the cost of having a PhD student work in my organization for several years. And I get pushback all the time about that. Universities won't do it. There's too many problems with IP. Who owns the IP? It doesn't matter. If you want to really kickstart industry engagement, that's a super easy way of doing it. And I think the most important one, and I know that there will be certain people in this room that will kind of roll their eyes, but until we change the advancement criteria for academics to include industry engagement, collaboration, innovation capture, until we actually put metrics alongside publications, teaching, performance, citations, we're basically not going to advance as an ecosystem from the university perspective. Now at Monash, which I have a faculty affiliation, I feel that this is a very active conversation. I know it's also an active conversation at Melbourne University and others, but this is something that has to change. And until ARC and NHMRC plays ball with that and actually gets behind the fact that early career researchers probably need different criteria to be evaluated that includes these collaborative aspects, probably not going to make a big difference. So that's the snowflakes, but then there's the river itself. So obviously executing and prosecuting intellectual property, costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of resources. Tech transfer offices in Australia usually are far too close to the administrative politics of a university to be effective. That's my personal opinion. I look in other countries, particularly the UK, and particularly leading universities like Oxford and Cambridge, that have literally turned their technology transfer organizations into standalone companies that have their own governance, their own benchmarks for success, their own KPIs. That's been a hugely positive thing, and it needs to happen here. Now, it does happen here. Not all universities in Australia are the same. But in general, there is a little bit too close a nexus between tech transfer and university administration, and it confers a risk-averse mentality. I also, by the way, as a side note, believe that we probably need to take more of a consortium approach. We don't create enough intellectual property in Australia to actually have a whole lot of independent, what are effectively independent marketing organizations. We should think of a smarter way of doing that, but that's probably beyond the scope of this talk tonight. And so we need to staff these organizations and run them effectively to be able to do their job. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because actually not everybody in the room cares about how you run a tech transfer organization. But again, based on sort of 25 comparable universities overseas, what we found is that the strongest correlation between tech transfer staffing was PhD students, again, right? So in US peer universities, we found that, as I said, 1 invention disclosure for 8 PhDs, 1 invention disclosure per 5 faculty, an average of 1 technology transfer officer per 48 faculty, and 1 technology transfer officer per 75 PhD students. Now, at a good-sized university like Melbourne or Monash, that is actually a lot of people. Why? Because technology transfer is a network function. You have to be able to interface. It's about business development. It's about building relationships over time and understanding how research evolves. And if you don't have the headcount to do that, you can't do it properly. And I believe that this is an area, again, where our universities essentially let themselves down. They don't cater for that human interfacing requirement. And by the way, a really big part of technology transfer is education. Right? It's actually spending time with people and helping them to understand what the value or not of their inventions are, and to make sure that they're aware of how to manage their innovation and their research output in the context of intellectual property. But the truth is, all of that's kind of academic until if you can't take a look at how it fits into the kind of money pile of a university. So this is how university revenue breaks down. You can see the majority of it is, just under half of it is from research block grants. Then there's the fees for domestic and overseas students. And then there's this little gray band here that's called consultancy and contract research. And you can see that it's basically been the same for about a decade. Knowledge commercialization, Australia produces a very nice set of numbers every year that basically breaks down that gray band into different revenue streams. And it turns out that what our technology transfer and industry engagement offices actually do is they generate about $100 million a year in royalties in relation to intellectual property developed at universities and affiliated institutions. And about half of that comes from the group of 8 universities. It also, very impressively, generates about $1 billion, and that's the majority of that gray line, about $1 billion in consultancy and contract research revenue. Not a high growth. It's been flat for about a decade, but it's about $1 billion a year. But the really tragic thing about those numbers is that in that $1 billion, of which the ratio is about 1/3 consultancy to contract research, the average materiality of those contracts is $10,000. Okay, so this pie chart here shows that literally thousands of contracts are being administered by our universities every single year that have a materiality of $10,000, i.e. irrelevant. Okay, so not only are we understaffing our technology transfer and commercialization functions, but we're making them do bullshit every single day, right? And that's what the numbers very clearly show. Not all of it, but a substantial proportion of it is not relevant. So, in thinking about this in the context of return on investment, it's pretty interesting. So, government spends $10 billion a year on research. About $2 billion goes out in research block, another $2 billion in ARC and NHMRC. So actually, I think that $100 million a year in royalties is pretty good. I hear a lot of people say that this is not very impressive, that it would be better off to put the money in a bank account. That would give you a better return on investment. But I think there's a lot of other benefits that come from that investment. I think that the $100 million in royalties is gravy on top of a lot of other great benefits. I really, truly believe that. What does not impress me is the consultancy, right? Because when I go to peer universities in the United States and Europe, in the UK, and I ask their industry development or their tech transfer organizations, how much revenue do you generate in consultancy every year? The answer that they give me is, we don't know because we don't measure it. Only in Australia do we uniquely have the capacity to measure that number. And I find that very disappointing because what it means is that we're inserting the university between knowledge sources and knowledge sinks. And I think this is the greatest impediment to effective industry engagement that exists in our university system. I really believe that universities should completely deregulate this aspect. I would be very happy for us not to know that we produced $1 billion in revenue every single year. Academics are allowed to do a day a week or 2 days a month of consulting. They should be allowed to just get on with it and do it. So the easy fixes are that the university should get off the pitch, right? That's the easiest solution. Universities are not clear about their innovation policies. I know even at Monash, you can find small variants of the same policy in different parts of the university website. They need to be clear. It needs to be more of a guiding principle rather than a detailed legislation, right? You know, if you are doing consultancy and you're using your graduate students, that's not okay, right? If you are doing consultancy and you're using your lab equipment, that's not okay, right? It's got to be more principle-driven rather than reading a size 9 font legislation, or university policy guide around tech transfer. We need to fund and staff our TTOs appropriately and make sure that they're doing the useful things. And by the way, I know they want to. I know people in most of the group of 8 tech transfer offices, and I know every single day they bleed to try to deliver the things that manage their revenue streams and kind of justify their existence from an administrative vantage point, but then deliver on the things that they're passionate about, which is that great invention or that spin-out company potential. I know that that's what they want, right? So we need to make sure that they are able to do that. And then we need to aggressively market our experts. Most university web pages don't have a button that says find an expert. Some do, but most don't. All right, so we should really understand that our human capital is the greatest asset that a university has. I do want to have a brief comment about equity. These are a select number of those basket of peer universities, and I put it up there because I want you to understand that I'm very aspirational about what Australian academia could be. So there's Caltech, MIT, Stanford. These are very, very decent universities, okay, by any metric. This graph shows the percentage of revenue that comes from holding equity in companies that spin out from the university using university technology. Now you'll note that Oxford and Cambridge are quite high. That's because, as I said before, they have corporatized their tech transfer functions, and they actually have investment functions as well. So they act almost as a quasi-VC or a quasi-private equity function. But the majority of these other organizations don't have revenue from equity. In fact, Stanford prefers not to take equity in the companies that they spin out. They prefer to have functioning royalty agreements. In the University of California system, there's actually legislation that prevents them from owning more than 10%, okay? So, because they're a public university. And this is not a unique reality. This is a systemic reality. Systemically, around the world, for the last decade, somewhere between 1% and 4% of income from intellectual property is from equity. So we should just abandon it. We shouldn't worry about it. Okay? And just to illustrate that, this is really my favorite illustration. So this is a company that I was involved with a few years ago, a company called CTI that developed a PET scanner, which is pretty well known to most of you. It's a positron emission tomography. This is a cornerstone of oncology management. These are all the smart guys that developed the technology. This is Ron, the entrepreneur, founded the company, worked for 20 years to make it a success. When the company sold to Siemens, it was worth about $1 billion. He owned about 5% of the company, I think, which would be pretty typical for a CEO. And so he made $50 million on the day. Pretty good outcome. This is Mike looking very smug and confident. Mike was the innovator. Mike was lucky to, at a time when universities didn't care much about patents, he took the patents himself, and then he licensed them to the company, and he took a royalty on every scanner that was sold. And here's the model. Here's the math. So 10 years of commercialization. This is roughly the increase in unit sales. This is Mike's royalty. So over a 10-year period, he made $120 million. And of course, he had the reinvestment capacity because he was constantly making money over that 20-year period. Or that 10-year period. So that commercial revenue stream to him was worth something like $400 million at the time that Ron's equity was worth 50. All right, so to me, that's a beautiful example, totally applicable to universities. Universities just shouldn't worry about equity. That's my viewpoint. So yes, by all means, own some stock if it makes a cheaper licensing agreement or there's some other reason for it. If there's an academic founder that really doesn't want to be involved with the company, perfectly reasonable for a university to hold some equity on trust. But no, otherwise stay away. And we have this issue, and I see it all the time, that sometimes universities think that being a shareholder of a company means that they have some fiduciary duty to the success of the company. And that's just not true, right? But I see it time and time again because of this association with failure. That somehow, by being a shareholder of that company and it being public domain, that if that company fails, that's a tarnish on the university. And I don't think that that's the case. So I think this is an issue that needs to be addressed. So, easy fix. Leave our equity alone. This is the emotional stages of denial of an entrepreneur receiving an equity proposal from a university. It's pretty accurate, I think. It's 26 stages of denial. So just to wrap up now, I want to talk very briefly about the money piece. Often hear venture capital or lack of venture capital being problematic, that our government policies are a little bit erratic because we have inconsistent election cycles. And then this lack of engagement of the capital markets, which is an interesting dilemma because if we have no capital market engagement, what that really means is that our innovation output is lousy because the market tells us, right? That's the reality. Okay, so first myth that needs to be debunked is that US is somehow this magical mecca for venture capital. It's just simply not true. And I've chosen an example partially for posterity and self-promotion, but this is from 2012. Every year, Nature Biotech does a roundup of investments in the biotech space. And I raised a Series A for a company in 2012, $12.5 million. And out of 5,200 new life sciences companies in 2012, only 17 companies raised more than 10 million, right? So that's tough. And I would have to tell you that outside of the major VC hotspots in the US, it's just as hard to raise money as it is to raise money in Australia, maybe even harder. So I think that this is mostly mythology. And the corollary to that is that Australian venture capital is also mostly irrelevant. There are a few good firms, but we really have no maturity and no real track record in venture capital in Australia. We recently announced this Biotechnology Translation Fund from the government. This actually exacerbated the insularity of our venture capital environment. Because what it did is it was so dependent on certain structures and it was so time limited, it didn't actually allow foreign venture capital to come into the country and say, yeah, we'd like to be here and we'd like to be part of this. It was so clearly geared towards enabling a few existing funds to get a bit more money. It was really disappointing. It was a huge policy farce in my viewpoint. And so as a consequence, venture capital has really almost no impact on university-led innovation. I'm not saying there aren't good initiatives, there are, but on the whole, I don't really think I can point to any metrics that show a correlation for success. So more dead bodies will help, so I'm in favor of that. And there is plenty of money about. I've never had any difficulty raising money for ventures. I think there are lots of high net worth individuals and family offices that will take a good look at something. There is plenty of money. And I think that the ASX is our homegrown alternative to venture capital, and my viewpoint is that it's better than venture capital. And by the way, just to note that globally, venture capital is mediocre, okay? This is, if you're interested in venture capital, this is a report you should read. It's put out by the Kauffman Foundation, which is a Bay Area think tank around entrepreneurship. They put out this great report called "We Have Met the Enemy and He Is Us," with the deliberate gender bias of that statement. And it's amazing. What they basically found out is that over a 10-year period, which is a typical lifespan of a venture fund, that as a fund of funds view, in the United States, venture capital returned 0% return on investment. Okay? So you are much better off putting your money in the bank. Well, probably not in the US, but certainly in Australia. Treasury yields are not very good, but certainly your 5% or your 4.5% in Australia would do you a much better job. And the other thing is that private investing with things like bioscience, clean tech, advanced materials, energy systems, these are things that have huge amounts of capital requirements and big horizons for, they're highly regulated environments. They require a lot of scale-up activity. And so I think personally, and I think there's a growing number of investors that feel similarly, that feel that things like biotech are just a poor fit with private investing. And even with the illiquidity of a microcap stock, even with the challenges of exiting from a small publicly traded company, that being able to change share ownership over time is still a good option to have. I personally have a filing cabinet full of share certificates of companies that I'll just probably never see liquidity out of, right? And if they were public, maybe I would have a shot. And so that brings us to Australia. We have the ASX. This is the deliberately scaled and weighted to be dramatic and obnoxious. We have CSL as our champion company. We have a few other things. Mesoblast used to be in that list, but isn't really anymore. We have this long tail of microcap companies that have an average market capitalization of $30 million. Now, I don't care what you think. This is not a public equity market. This is venture capital operating in the public domain. And I think it's good, right? I think it has a lot of potential. But it could be also a lot better. So the bad news is that it really lacks quality and integrity. I think that academia is a big partner in this lack of integrity of the ASX. I think we have like a lot of 2000 era companies that just should go away. And be replaced with things that are a lot more interesting, that are coming out of labs that are 100 yards away from this auditorium. I think that that ASIC, that our regulator, is relatively toothless in biosciences. I think there's a whole lot of basic things that we could do, and this is a great place for government to play. This is actually a place where government can be very beneficial. Because our superannuation funds don't consider Australian biosciences to be an investable asset class. They are bending over backwards to invest in the US because the US bioscience market, particularly in the performance of the last 3 or 4 years, has established itself truly as an investable asset class. Right? So that's something really important we need to change. Because I believe that until the capital markets actually support innovative ideas going out and getting, on a recurrent basis, access to capital, basically nothing we do underneath it is going to make a difference. It's basically a ceiling on everything that we do in an innovation context. But the good news is that the regulation is totally commensurate with the stage of development of these companies. It's not arduous to be an ASX-listed company, especially compared to a US publicly traded company. And we get excited about another $10, $50, $100 million of research money being available from the government, or we bemoan the fact that actually university research block funding has gone down by 20% in the last few years. But we couldn't imagine the amount of money that would flood into biosciences and tech from our pension funds and our wealth funds and our self-managed super funds. Money would flow if we could actually show that the quality was there. There's a huge amount of financial momentum to unlock. I'll pass on examples. But what I will say is that there are some easy fixes, and I'll sort of wrap up at this point. I think that our industry organizations can play a huge role in making this better. Their membership is a testament to their quality of opinion and policy contributions. They can do a lot better. We need a new code of conduct for ASX-listed companies. If we're really to have a vibrant microcap environment, there needs to be better code of conduct around disclosure. We need this narrow, if we're going to have this narrow valley between the lab and the public markets, we need to have lots of sophisticated commentary and analysis about it, and it needs to be understandable. So for all the science communicators that are out there in the audience, we need you. And I believe that our universities have a big role. They have to be complicit in pushing this message of quality and integrity in the science that goes into these companies. Because if we just put garbage into those companies, we're never really going to have an exciting and dynamic landscape. So just to wrap up, this really brings us to the topic of leadership. And for me, it's pretty simple. Australia's traditional industries have been things like mining and retail, banking, and then some specific asset classes like property that sit underneath that. And for the last 2 decades, it's been really easy for us to make money, tremendous and stupendous amounts of money out of those sectors, right? And so every time the government puts out this idea of economic diversification and innovation being a part of it, what they effectively do is they hand a noose out, and then they kind of loosely put it around their neck and wait for accountability for return on investment. Because really, in order to move out of those traditional areas, they have to show that those new innovation investments provide a greater or equal or greater return on investment. And so the result of that is we end up picking winners. And in my view, picking winners to ensure a return on investment, to de-risk the idea of economic diversification is a huge disaster for university innovation. Right? And I hear all these reasons why we should do it. We can't do it all, we're small, we have to align with our exports. I really don't think that any of that is true. So my viewpoint of it is that government has done a great job in the last 2 years making innovation sexy, talking about it. I wish we still had Wyatt Roy, although he's clowning about in Afghanistan or something stupid at the moment. But I wish we had more of these touch points to go out to young people who are doing the innovative stuff and encouraging them to be successful and to get interested. I think the role of government is absolutely make sure that funding is competitive. By the way, not very popularly, I think that includes the R&D tax credit. I think that the Farrell-Finkel viewpoint that R&D tax should be thresholded is a bit sad, but I think it's true. I think we have a lot of completely unviable companies that are not contributing to our exports that simply stay alive because they get a check from taxpayer every year. And I think we need to get rid of it. Less bureaucracy is better. I don't understand why we still haven't fully reformed things like employee incentives. We've gone part of the way. We should go all the way. We've been talking about it for 20 years. I think that what governments should be doing is keeping up the investment in universities and making sure that our cities are world class. I will tell you, every time I get a new opportunity overseas, I think very carefully about leaving the most livable city in the world, right? And I think that ultimately, in the long game, what will attract entrepreneurs and what will make Australia a great place is if it's a great place to live. Because why would you ever want to leave? If you can have a hot startup company here that's listed on the ASX, and you can go surfing at Bondi in the evening, what more could you ask for, right? And then obviously immigration policies. And I feel very strongly about this because I see people that come across, from Indonesia, Malaysia, some of our proximal neighbors to get an education, and then find it challenging to stay. And I think that if we invest in that skill development, we should try to capture it and make sure that it's our economic advantage, not Singapore's economic advantage or Malaysia's economic advantage. So that's what I think government can do. So anyway, I'll wrap up there, but just say that there's a lot of mythology out there about risk, about culture, and I think that we should just dispel it. I think we should stop standing at the abyss and looking. If all we see is blackness and there aren't bodies in there, that means we're not doing what we should be doing. So to conclude, I'm optimistic, but we need to pick winning people, not winning market segments. I really believe that universities need to deregulate this industry engagement and just make it easy. This is just a huge opportunity. I would be more interested in removing barriers than I am trying to drive outcomes. And I think that a lot of the innovation discussion right now is how do we achieve certain outcomes? And I just don't think it's the right conversation to have. And we're not Silicon Valley. We have really different growth engines. So we should try to identify what they are and really leverage them. And I think that would result in a successful outcome. And finally, I think the market will decide. So let's actually make sure that our market is efficient, that it understands technology, that it's sophisticated, that it can separate the wheat from the chaff, right? And that it has integrity. And I think if we do all of these things, our university ecosystem will thrive, that our national innovation ecosystem will thrive, and I think we could be something really special on the world stage, because there's just fabulous ideas and fabulous people here. So thank you. I'll leave it there.